So the next part of our ecology unit is actually taxonomy, and taxonomy means classification or classifying organisms based on their characteristics. So not taxidermy. Taxidermy is what people do when someone goes hunting and, I don't know, kills something and then they like stuff it. That's taxidermy. So taxonomy is classification of living things. Now, back in the day, ancient Greek times, Aristotle was one of the first recorded individuals to kind of try and classify organisms. But what he did is he classified them according to like where they live. So it was basically organisms that live in the sky, like birds and bats or whatever, organisms that live in the water, organisms that live on land. That's kind of how he classified organisms. And keep in mind that he was working basically on the Greek islands there, and so a limited number of organisms compared to the world as a whole. Now, today, with modern classification, we basically classify organisms into series of groupings or categories based on structure, okay, so their physical structure, the function of those structures, and the biochemistry. So the biochemistry would be genetic relationships, and that one is emerging to be kind of the most important, because now that we're starting to recognize the genomes of different organisms, we can actually compare organisms on a genetic level, which is superior to categorizing them just based on what we can observe. So the science of classifying organisms is called taxonomy, and a person or scientist rather that actually does this work is called a taxonomist. Now this is an ongoing flexible and fluid sort of science, in the sense that as we learn more and more about organisms and new organisms are still being discovered, then classification is kind of an ongoing thing. So I want you to make sure that you do watch this video that's on this slide called The Classification of Life, because before you move on, because it's an excellent introduction to kind of the history of taxonomy and the main players in the science of taxonomy throughout history. And you can expect, because I haven't done a Edpuzzle on this one, you can expect that when we do our assessment on taxonomy going forward, there will be a couple of questions based on this video. So please make sure that you do review that before moving on to the next slide. So we're going to start with classification in terms of the most general category, which is the domain. So there are considered to be 3 domains of life. These are very large, because if you think of all the living things on the planet, all of them, whether they're insects or mammals or trees or bacteria, all of them can be classified into one of 3 very large domains of life. So this is the most general level that an organism can be grouped into, and there are 3 domains. They are archaea, bacteria, which is also sometimes called eubacteria, and not you as in Y-O-U, but EU, okay, as a prefix there, eubacteria, and then there's eukarya, which is also sometimes called eukaryota or eukaryote. Okay, so it just depends what source you're looking at. Okay, but the root words kind of all are the same there. So archaea, bacteria or eubacteria, and eukarya or eukaryote. Now, one of the most important characteristics in terms of classifying organisms into a domain is whether or not they are prokaryotic or eukaryotic. And you may remember this from Science 10, maybe. Okay, so the difference between the two is last year when you studied plant cells and animal cells, what you needed to think about is what their nucleus was like, or if they even had a nucleus. So when we classify organisms as prokaryote or prokaryotic, this means that they have genetic material in their cells, but it's not a membrane-bound nucleus. Okay, so if you think of a bacterium, okay, so just think of this as being some random bacterium. Instead of having a membrane-bound nucleus, the DNA strand is loose in the cytoplasm of that particular cell. Okay, so it's not a membrane-bound organism. So that's a very important categorization when it comes to living things. Now, a eukaryotic organism or a eukaryote is an organism whose cells have a membrane-bound nucleus. So this would have been like last year when you studied like those rectangular kind of shaped plant cells, for example. Okay, and remember you studied all of those organelles. So you had like the cell wall and the cell membrane and that big central vacuole, right? But then what you also had in these cells is you had a nucleus in which the genetic material was housed. Okay, so a membrane-bound nucleus. So eukaryotic organisms have a membrane-bound nucleus in which the genetic material is held. Prokaryotic organisms, their cells have their DNA loose in the cytoplasm. there is no membrane-bound nucleus. So that is a very important distinction when we are categorizing living things. So let's take a look at a graphic of the three domains of life, and I already have some annotation on here that I kind of kept from a previous class, so I wouldn't forget anything. But I also want you to take a look at the size of these three different bubbles for the domains, because that is significant. So if you take a look at the eukaryota or eukaryote domain, you can see that that bubble is very, very large. If we look at the eubacteria and the archaea, you can see that those are fairly close together in size, the archaea being slightly smaller than the eubacteria. So let's just take a look here and break down each of these domains of life. And what's important here in terms of a test situation is you need to be able to identify what kind of organisms you would find in each of these three different domains. Okay, now I would never give you a random scientific name for something and expect that you know where it fits into, but based on the description of the characteristics of the organism, you should be able to fit it into a domain. So for example, if I kind of said this organism is multicellular with a membrane-bound nucleus, then you should be able to say, oh, okay, if it's multicellular and the nucleus is membrane-bound with the DNA in there, it has to be in the domain eukaryota. Okay, so that would be my expectation. So taking a look at the different domains here, let's start with eubacteria. Now, I told you on the previous slide that the prefix for eubacteria, that EU, actually means true bacteria. And what I want you to think about is that this bacteria lives where we live. So that's why it's called true bacteria. So it lives in oxygen based environments, okay, or aerobic environments where oxygen is available. So examples of this would be that cyanobacteria that we talked about before. That's very important. So the cyanobacteria, of course, is considered to be that bacteria that initiated the oxidizing environment on our planet. It also is that algae that builds up during algal bloom or creates that algal bloom process. So that part's not that great. And then we have carbon-eating heterotrophic bacteria, so bacteria that actually consume other organisms. This would also be bacteria that can make you sick, like if you think of bacterial infections, okay, that we would use antibiotics for, bacteria that we would find on surfaces, okay, so this is the bacteria that lives where we live, okay, but what is important about the eubacteria and the archaeans is that they are both prokaryotic, okay, so remember what that means. They are both prokaryotic, and that means that they have their DNA loose in their cytoplasm. Okay, so looking at this little graphic here, there is that bacterial cell. It has that strand of DNA loose in the cytoplasm. There's no membrane-bound nucleus, and you can see that they are unicellular as well. Okay, so single-celled organisms. So when we move on to the archaeans, what makes the archaeans different from the eubacteria? Remember, the eubacteria is the true bacteria. That is the bacteria that lives where we live. The archaeans live in environments that are not hospitable to life in general. So we would find the archaeans in extreme heat environments like volcanic vents. We would find them in extreme saline environments, okay, like very saline ocean environments, for example, where most living things cannot live. And so sometimes another word that we use for the archaeans is the extremophiles, okay, or extremophils, because they are organisms, bacteria, that can live in very extreme environments where the eubacteria cannot live. Now, keep in mind, they still share characteristics with the eubacteria. They are unicellular, they are prokaryotic, meaning they don't have that membrane-bound nucleus. They are bacteria, okay? But the archaeans are different because they can live in very extreme environments where the eubacteria, which require oxygenated environments, cannot live. Okay, so that's significant. Now, if we go over to the eukaryotes or the domain eukaryota, I want you to notice how big that circle is. And that's because look at all of the different things we have in there. We have animals, we have fungi, and fungi would be things like mushrooms and molds and yeasts. We have all of the plants, okay? We have chromists, that would be like sea kelp and plankton. Right? Remember the phytoplankton that actually produces oxygen in the ocean. We also have the protists. And sometimes kids will confuse the protists because they are single-celled, okay? And then they will put them into one of the eubacteria or the archaean domains because they are single-celled. But the difference is is that protists actually are eukaryotic. They have a membrane-bound nucleus. And an example of a protist that you are probably familiar with is an amoeba or even a paramecium you've probably heard of before. So amoebas are those kind of weird little like jelly-like pond water organisms. And while protists like amoebas and parameciums, euglena, etc., are single-celled, they have a membrane-bound nucleus in which their DNA is contained. And that is why they are not classified as bacteria or archaeans. They are not prokaryotes, okay? They are eukaryotic. They have their very own kingdom, the kingdom Protista, but they are considered to be in the domain Eukaryota because they have a membrane-bound nucleus. In fact, that's the only characteristic you need to be in the domain Eukarya, is that you have to have a membrane-bound nucleus. It doesn't matter if you're single-celled or multicellular, as long as you have a membrane-bound nucleus, you get to be in the domain Eukaryota. So now we're going to start getting more specific. So we talked about the three domains: the eubacteria, the archaeans rather, and the domain Eukaryota. And now we're going to get a little more specific, and we're going to start to talk about the 6 kingdoms. And there is a little bit of overlap here because you can see that we see the terms eubacteria and the archaeans are kind of there too. So there is a little bit of overlap, but let's just take a look at the kingdoms. And I'm sure that some of these you are already quite familiar with. So there are considered today to be 6 kingdoms, and the 6 kingdoms are Animalia, which I'm sure you've heard of before. That would include all animals, regardless of whether they are invertebrates or vertebrates, so backbone, no backbone. All animals would fall into the kingdom Animalia. And to be an animal, there's a couple of things that you need to be able to do. You need to be able to locomote or move. That's like one of the things, because if you think of like, plants and fungi, they aren't able to move or whatever. So this would include insects, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish, birds, worms, etc. And then we have the kingdom Plantae. Again, that's probably pretty straightforward. That would include things like the mosses, the ferns, the conifers, and the flowering plants. And in fact, these are actually in order based on their appearance on the planet. So mosses are considered to be the most primitive of plants, and then ferns, and then conifers, which are our cone-bearing plants, like that would be our spruce trees and pine trees and that kind of stuff that we still see today. And then lastly would be our flowering plants, which are called our angiosperms. So they are considered to be the most evolved of the plant kingdom because they produce flowers for reproduction. Then we have the kingdom Fungi, and that would include things like mushrooms, molds, and yeasts. We have the kingdom Protista, and we talked a little bit about that one when we talked about the domain Eukaryota before. And the kingdom Protista, one thing that distinguishes Protista from the other 3 kingdoms above is that this is a unicellular kingdom, okay? So they are still eukaryotes. They have that membrane-bound nucleus, but they are unicellular or single-celled. Now, one thing to note, though, when it comes to the kingdom Fungi, some of them are multicellular, like if you think of mushrooms and toadstools, those are going to be multicellular, but some of the members of the kingdom Fungi are single-celled. So it just, like yeast, for example. So it just depends which organism you're talking about within that kingdom. And then we have the kingdom Monera, and sometimes it's called the kingdom Prokaryote, kingdom Eubacteria, but Monera kind of persists as the most common term that's used for this kingdom. And this would contain all kinds of bacteria, every single type of bacteria except those extremophiles that we talked about before. And in fact, the archaeans then have their own kingdom that distinguishes them from the kingdom Monera. So remember, they are both bacteria, they are both prokaryotic, okay, but the difference is where they live or their habitat. So remember that the archaeans are those extremophiles that live in those environments where typical bacteria or true bacteria cannot live. So the archaeans are kind of special because they have their own domain, and then they also have their own kingdom. Now, once again, I would never give you some random scientific name for something that you have no clue what it is and expect that you know which kingdom it falls into. Okay, that is beyond scope for us. What you do need to know is the general characteristics of the different kingdoms. So for example, in Animalia, these are multicellular, organisms that are eukaryotic, for example, capable of locomotion, yada yada, right? So I would never give you anything that's really random, especially scientific names that you wouldn't be able to identify. So this little slide is kind of good because it gives us a visual and then a really succinct synopsis of the characteristics of the different domains, or sorry, the different kingdoms. So you can see we have our 6 kingdoms here, just like we looked at on the previous slide. And this time we kind of start with the most simplistic, and then we kind of progress through to Animalia, which is considered to be in the hierarchy of kingdoms the most advanced. So this is, like I said, just a really good little synopsis. So make sure you take a look at those characteristics so that you know which kingdoms involve unicellular versus multicellular, eukaryotic versus prokaryotic, etc. Autotrophs versus heterotrophs, right? So you can kind of look here that when we look at the fungi, for example, and this is one thing that actually throws kids off quite a bit. Fungi are actually heterotrophs, and remember what that means. If you're a heterotroph, that means that you have to actually take food in from your environment, right? And plants are autotrophic, right? Which means that they are capable of making their own food, primarily through photosynthesis. There are some plants, like if you think of like the Venus flytraps and the pitcher plants, for example, they are capable of kind of doing both. So they're green, they do have chlorophyll, so they are capable of photosynthesis, but they also supplement their nutrient intake with animal products. And in fact, pitcher plants are kind of weird. Some pitcher plants in some of the rainforests can get huge, like 6 feet tall, and they're like these, or even taller than that. Some of them are like giant, and they kind of are called pitcher plants because they look kind of like a pitcher that you would put like flowers in, or like use for drinks or whatever. And so some of them are like huge, like 7 feet tall, and they have really slippery slide surfaces. And so sometimes unsuspecting, monkeys and stuff will like fall into the pitcher plants. And because the slides are kind of covered with this mucousy stuff, it's super, super slippery and they can't get out. And then on the bottom, it's kind of nasty, but there's like these digestive juices that kind of just like dissolve and break down the monkey, and then, then the nutrients are absorbed into the plant tissue. So in the plant kingdom, yes, plants are primarily autotrophic, meaning they use photosynthesis to make their own food, but we do have certain special families of plants that are capable of supplementing with other food sources besides making their own food. And then animals, of course, one of the main characteristics of animals, they are multicellular, and they as well are heterotrophic. Now, just going back to the fungi for a second there, again, sometimes people kind of think that fungi are plants. They are not. Fungi do not have chlorophyll and other pigments. They are not capable of making their own food. They actually have to absorb food from their environments, okay? So they are actually heterotrophic, not autotrophic. So that's a very important distinction. So just a little bit of terminology to review here. So I think we talked about extremophiles already, so I'll leave that one. But one important term that we haven't talked about yet, even though we talked about the organisms involved with this, is the saprophytes. And the saprophytes are organisms that are capable of external digestion, okay, which sounds kind of weird. So we partake in internal digestion because of our digestive system. Our digestive system is on the inside of our body. But when we talk about these guys here, okay, so these would be from the kingdom fungi, of course. These guys are saprophytes, these mushrooms. So what that means is they have digestive secretions. So if you've ever like picked a mushroom off the lawn or something, like you can feel it's kind of slimy or whatever. So those are actually digestive secretions. And when food is kind of blown on the wind and whatever onto the surface of the mushrooms, then what happens is those digestive juices actually break down that material and then absorb it into the mushroom's tissues itself. Okay, so that's pretty special. So not all organisms are capable of that, but the mushrooms would be an example of the saprophytes in that they have that external digestion piece as opposed to internal digestion. And then, of course, we talked about chemosynthesizers already in our previous little section on populations. And just remember that chemosynthesizers are also autotrophs. Okay, they are also capable of producing their own food, just like producers. However, they actually convert inorganic to inorganic when they are making their food, whereas autotrophs that are termed producers they, remember, produce those inorganic components like carbon dioxide and water into organic components, primarily that glucose. So now we're going to get even more specific yet. So we've talked about domains, we've talked about our 6 kingdoms, and now we're going to talk about the hierarchical system. The hierarchical system is very specific in our program of studies. You can expect to see multiple questions when you're assessed on this content on the hierarchical system and your understanding of the hierarchical system. But let me reiterate that you are never responsible for knowing or memorizing any scientific names of organisms and be expected to classify them according to their scientific names, but you will have to demonstrate your understanding in other ways. So when we talk about the hierarchical system, the term hierarchy in general is very simply a system of organization in which groups are divided and then subdivided and subdivided again until they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and more specific. So in biology, we don't use the term groupings or levels. We actually use the terms taxa and taxon. So a level of organization in the hierarchical system for biology, plural, we would use taxa, and singular, so just one of those levels or groupings, we would call taxon. So remember, we talked about that word taxonomy, right? Classification. And for our purpose in the program of studies, there are 8 taxa that we are responsible for being familiar with, okay? Sometimes you'll see 9, sometimes even 10 taxa, depending on what sources you're looking at. But our program of studies is very specific that we need to know kind of the main 8. Now, one thing to remember about taxonomy is that taxonomy, in terms of our hierarchical system, is kind of like an inverted pyramid or an upside down pyramid. So we start with the very, very general, and as we go down towards the bottom of that inverted pyramid, you can see that we get smaller and smaller and smaller. And what that means is there are fewer organisms the further down we go. Those organisms are more related the further down we go. So once we get down to the very bottom, now we're talking about a specific species, okay? So that's very important when we talk about the hierarchical system. Okay, so the hierarchical system, as we already mentioned, we go from the most general to the most specific. So we've already talked about the domains and the kingdoms, okay? We have our 3 domains, remember that? See if you can remember what they are. Eubacteria, Archaea, and Eukaryote, right? Or Eukaryota. And then we talked about our 6 kingdoms, right? Animalia, Plantae, and so on. And now we're going to take a look at the remaining pieces of the hierarchical system. So if we take a look, after kingdom, we then have phylum. And here's where sometimes you will see an extra little category or an extra little taxon in there rather. Sometimes you'll see a subphylum under here. And for our purposes, though, we don't worry about subphylum, okay? So we're just responsible for these 8 levels. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And I want you to think about what we talked about already on the previous slide, that this is like an inverted pyramid. So remember, the domain, there's only 3 of those. So that's a very, very large category. Kingdoms, there's 6 of them, so we start to get more specific. Phylum, an example of phylum would be chordata. So that's where we would be, okay, because we are chordates. And what that means is we have a backbone. Okay, so that would be an example of a phylum. Okay, so not all animals would fit in there. For example, beetles, insects do not have backbones. Crustaceans like crabs and lobsters and that, they don't have backbones. So they would not be in there with us. Okay, so a phylum gets more and more specific. And then we have class, order, family, genus, and species. And if we're going to compare this to our little inverted pyramid over here, the species is going to be at the very bottom because that is the most specific category in the hierarchical system. And so an example of that, if we're again still talking about us, is our scientific name is Homo sapien. And that is our species. So there would be nothing else in that category with us except other human beings, other Homo sapiens. Okay, so remember, once we get to the very bottom of that hierarchical system, we are talking about an individual species and they're going to be in there by themselves. Okay, Now, there's many different mnemonics that have been developed over the years to remember the hierarchical system. You need to just commit yourself to knowing one. So in the video that I assigned you guys earlier on that first page, there's a dumb King Philip or something instead, whatever. It doesn't really matter which mnemonic you use. The whole point of a mnemonic is to help you remember the hierarchical system's order. Okay, so dumb King Philip's child owned 5 green snakes. Okay, that's one of the many mnemonics over the years that's been developed for this hierarchical system, but you can see how that works. D for domain, K for kingdom, P for phylum, C for class, order, family, genus, and species. So just commit that to memory. It'll serve you well as you go forward in your studies with biology, and that will help you remember the hierarchical system's order. Okay, so here's a visual of the hierarchical system. So you can see we have our taxa here, right? So we have our domain. You'll notice this one's extra, okay? So remember I talked about how we sometimes have extra levels in the hierarchical system depending on the source. So here we have a supergroup, but we do not need to worry about supergroups. And we don't see subphylum here, but remember what I said before, sometimes you'll see subphylum, but these are the ones we are responsible for. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Okay, so one thing to notice here is here's kind of that inverted pyramid thing that we talked about, although it's kind of only half of the inverted pyramid. But remember what I said, when we're up here in a domain, okay, and this is only one of the domains, so this is eukarya, right? So all of the organisms that are in this domain are eukaryotic. They all have a membrane-bound nuclei. So look how general this is. We have everything from cactuses to phytoplankton to gazelles and rodents and mushrooms and everything in there, okay? So this, remember, the domain is super, super broad. Now, as we go down the hierarchical system, you can see that inverted pyramid piece. So the number of species becomes fewer and fewer as we go down. So next, if we look at the kingdom, the one that is in question here is Animalia, because we're going to end up down here at the gray wolf, right? So now we've gotten rid of everything that's not an animal. So you'll notice that we no longer see the mushrooms in there. We no longer see the cactus in there. We no longer see the insects the trees in there or anything like that. This is only the animals now. So you can see that our numbers are getting smaller and smaller, but these are more related to one another. Okay, so a lizard is more related to a wolf than a mushroom is related to a wolf, right? So you can see how we are kind of becoming more and more similar to one another. So in our phylum, we talked about this one on the previous slide. Now we're down to chordata, which means that all of the organisms that are in this particular phylum have to have a backbone. So you'll notice now then that we've gotten rid of insects, we've gotten rid of the snail, okay? We've gotten rid of any of those organisms that do not have internal backbones, because that's what it means to be a chordate. You have an internal backbone, or what we call an endoskeleton. So you'll notice that we have much fewer numbers here now. So we've gone all the way from greater than 1 million to about 50,000-ish, okay? So getting smaller and smaller. Now we get even more narrow again, and now we have the class Mammalia. In order to be in this class, you have to have certain characteristics. So you notice the fish aren't in there anymore, the snakes aren't in there anymore, the birds aren't in there anymore, the frogs aren't in there anymore, right? Because in order to be a mammal, you have to have certain characteristics. Primarily, you give birth to your young live, you produce milk for your young, you have fur, you are warm-blooded. Okay, so there's all of those characteristics that you must have in order to be a mammal. All right, so now we go to the order Carnivora. Okay, and if you think of the root of that, that means carnivore. So now we've gotten rid of all the herbivores. Okay, so we no longer see the antelope, we no longer see the cow or the deer in there or the rabbits in there. Now we only have the carnivores, hyenas, leopards, wolves, foxes, that kind of stuff, right? Now that doesn't mean that, the bears don't eat stuff other than, because bears are omnivores, but they would still be in this order because they do eat meat, which distinguishes them from organisms that do not eat meat, okay? And then we have the family Canidae. So that is the dog family. So now we've gotten rid of the bears, we've gotten rid of the leopards, so the big cats don't belong in here. Okay, so now this is just the dog family. So we have the foxes, we have the coyotes, we have the wolves. This is a African dog here. Okay, so notice the hyena's not there in there anymore. I know hyenas kind of look like they're dogs, but they actually are not in the family Canidae. And then more specific yet, now we have Canis. Okay, so now you can see we just have the wolves, the coyotes, the wild dog. Okay, and now we are down to the very most specific taxa, or taxon rather, in the hierarchical system. And this would be the individual species. Now, one important thing to remember when we are naming an organism, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide because it's called binomial nomenclature. One thing to remember is that when we name a species scientifically, we actually use the genus and the species name together. So in fact, the scientific name for the gray wolf, also sometimes known as the timber wolf, but more commonly known as the gray wolf, is Canis lupus. And you'll notice that the Canis is capitalized, the lupus is not. Okay, now what does that mean exactly? Well, that means that organisms that share the same genus name, like the coyote, are very closely related to wolves, and in fact even domestic dogs. They are called Canis domesticus, or sometimes called Canis familiaris. They still have that genus name Canis, so they are super closely related to wolves, can still interbreed with wolves, but are not considered to be the same species. Okay, so that is your hierarchical system. I hope this visual helped you understand that. Now again, you're never going to have to memorize, okay, the different phylums and the different classes and everything like that, but you need to be able to draw conclusions based on your knowledge of the hierarchical system. So on to binomial nomenclature, and if we kind of break down the terminology, binomial nomenclature, okay, so bi of course means two, nomial means name, and then nomenclature is a naming system, right? So if you think of, like in chemistry, you have the IUPAC rules for nomenclature, right, for naming ionic molecular compounds, etc. This is the same kind of idea, except it's for naming living things in biology. So let's take a look at what that is all about. So first of all organisms are given a scientific name in Latin. And if you think about Latin as a language, Latin is what we call a dead language. So what that means is we no longer use Latin anywhere in the world as a language of conversation. And that means, of course, that it's dead. The reason that Latin is used, if we look at our little graphic over here with our cute little cat, the reason that it is used is because it provides consistency around the world in terms of naming organisms. So if you are a biologist in Canada and then you travel to somewhere in the Middle East to study, scientific names are consistent because Latin is a dead language and therefore it's not changing or evolving. So the little cat says, you don't have to worry, I have a name that everybody knows, and my name is Felis catus. And so Felis, of course, being the genus name, right? The cat family, and then catus, of course, being the species name. So if we kind of look at these other languages here, there's just a few examples. So like in Spanish, it's gato, and in Swedish, it's cat, etc. So if we were to use all these different languages for naming organisms, there would be a lot of inconsistency. So that's why Latin is always used for naming living things. So when we talk about binomial nomenclature, we talked a little bit about that before. And the scientific name is composed of two parts in that hierarchical system. So the first name in an organism's scientific name is the genus. So if we look back to our little cat example here, Felis would be the genus, and notice that that is capitalized. And then the second is our very bottom of our little inverted pyramid in the hierarchical system, and that would be the species. And if we take a look here, catus is lowercase. So there are some rules with respect to how we actually write out scientific names. And the first rule is that the genus name is always first and it's capitalized, and the species name is always second and it's lowercase. So continuing along with our binomial nomenclature, it is worthwhile to take a look at this individual here who was actually mentioned in the video that you watched, right, at the very beginning. And this is Carl Linné. And you can see it says Linné here. This was his original name because he was Swedish. But what's interesting is he actually, for his work purposes, changed his name to Carolus Linnaeus. So he is the father of the binomial nomenclature system. He is the one that decided to use Latin. And so I guess, I don't know, maybe that was a tip of his hat to the Latin language that he actually changed his name for his professional work from Carl Linné to Carolus Linnaeus. So I don't know, I guess if you just add a US to the end of everything, it kind of Latinizes it, sort of, kind of. Anyway, so that's why sometimes you see his name as Carolus Linnaeus as opposed to Carl Linné. So he is kind of known as the father of the binomial nomenclature system. So in terms of the rules for writing out those scientific names, two of them we already covered on the previous slide. So the genus name is always first and it's capitalized. The species name is always second and it's always lowercase. Now, there's a few other words that, or sorry, rules rather, that apply if you are writing it out, like paper pencil writing it out versus doing it on a computer, right? So in computer text. So if you are actually writing it, so let's say you're doing an assignment in your handwriting, then you have to underline the name, okay? So the rules for the genus and the species still apply. Genus first capitalized, species second lowercase, but then you underline the name, okay? Because to signify that it is the scientific name of the organism. Now, if on the other hand, so if you were submitting an assignment to me in a Google Doc, and as a result you were using your computer, then you need to italicize. So the reason we underline when we're handwriting is because everybody's handwriting is very different. You can't tell what's, what's italicized, what's not italicized, whatever. So that's why we use underlining. But of course, when we're using a digital format, we can actually have consistency with italicizing words. And so then we would use italicizing. So in a test situation, or in a assignment situation, if you are asked to name something scientifically, I'm going to be looking for the fact that you are following these 4 rules, particularly, of course, well, 3 rules, I guess, because number 4 would apply, not number 3, in the submission of your answers, okay? So, and here's just an example that, Homo sapiens, we talked about that one before. Although now that I look at this, we don't need the underlining here, right? Because it would be italicized because it's typed out. So we talked about Carolus Linnaeus, Carl Linné, and again, he is known as the father of binomial nomenclature. So let's just take a look at another one of our sort of inverted pyramids, just so we can make sure we're understanding the binomial nomenclature and the hierarchical system, because the next step is being able to apply our knowledge to compare the relatedness of different organisms. So if we take a look at this hierarchical system, I want you to think about which part of the hierarchical system, first of all, is missing on this. And if you said the domain, then you are correct. Okay, so we don't have the domain here. But the next thing I want you to do then is, given that we have a grizzly bear, black bear, and so on, which domain would we actually put up here if I asked you to fill that in? And given that these are all multicellular organisms, you should have said eukaryotes. I'm just going to abbreviate that. Okay, so that would be the domain. And then, of course, the kingdom is Animalia, phylum Chordata, and so on. Okay, so the reason I'm kind of showing you this one is that, again, just how do we use this information in a test situation or an assessment situation? So what is the expectation? The expectation is that you understand how the hierarchical system works. And what I mean by that is, if we take a look down here, so let's maybe kind of cut things off right here, kind of where our bears are. All right, so the family Ursidae is the bear family. Okay, and if you are a person who likes astronomy, there's like the constellations, Ursus Major, Ursus Minor, so that's Latin for bear. Okay, so the bear family in this particular graphic, these aren't the only ones that are in there. Obviously, you have a polar bear in there as well, etc. But this is just the example we're using. So you have a grizzly, you have a black bear, you have a panda. Okay, so what this means is this. If an organism shares the same family, for example, okay, then that would logically mean that they must also share everything above that in the hierarchical system. Because if you think about it, it doesn't make sense that these bears are all in the same family, but they're in a different phylum. So how does that make sense? They can't be like all bears, but one of them doesn't have a backbone. Okay, that doesn't make sense. And indeed, if you look at it, you can see that the grizzly is all the way up to the top, the black bear all the way up to the top, the panda all the way up to the top. So because they're in the same family, they share not only that taxa, taxon rather, they share all the other taxa all the way up to the domain as well. Okay, now if we go down to our next level here, which is the genus, you can see that the panda is no longer there. Okay, so while the panda has everything from family up all the way to domain in common with the other two bears, the black bear and the grizzly bear, it does not have the same genus in common. But the grizzly and the black bear would have everything from the genus up in common. Okay, now we're going to apply that on our next slide. So again, remember, when we get down to our individual here, okay, our species, notice that we are using our binomial nomenclature. So the name is italicized. The genus name is first, and it is capitalized. The species name is second. And indeed, if we were going to name that black bear, the black bear is in the same genus, right? So it's going to have the same first scientific name as the grizzly bear. So it will also be Ursus as its the first part of its scientific name, but then it would be Americanus instead of Arctus. Okay, Americanus. Again, Latin for American, right? The American bear is kind of what that means if we were to translate that to English. So they share the same genus. This means they're super closely related to one another, but not exactly the same species. And why? Because remember what it means to be a species. You have to be willing and able to reproduce, and you have to have fertile offspring. Black bears and grizzly bears do not reproduce, even though they inhabit the same habitat in the taiga or the boreal forest biome. Okay, so here is where we apply what we have learned about the hierarchical system and binomial nomenclature. So this is what you would be expected to do in a test situation. You are given a chart that shows all of the taxa in the hierarchical system from domain all the way down to species. You are given some information, okay, but you also notice that you have some blanks in there. And so there is information that is not filled in that you will have to fill in based on the information that you're given. Now, what is key here is that you have to remember what we talked about on the previous slide. Whatever level an organism shares in common, everything above that has to be the same. So the best way to approach this is actually to start from the bottom up. Okay, so if we take a look at the very bottom of our hierarchical system, we of course have our species, and we would not expect any of these to be the same. So we have Arctus, we have Catus, we have Familiaris, we have Orca, and we have Lupus. Okay, so obviously none of those species names are going to be the same because they are all different species. So the next thing we do is we move up to genus. And if we move up to our next level, genus here, we look for common names. So we have an Ursus, genus Ursus, genus Felis, genus Canis, genus Orcinus, and another genus Canis. So here's your starting point. So we have two organisms here that share the same genus name. Now what that tells us is that they are super closely related. And in fact, Canis familiaris is a domestic dog. Sometimes they're called Canis domesticus, but Familiaris domesticus, and then Canis lupus is that gray wolf that we kind of talked about before. Now remember what we said. If an organism shares the same genus, they are super closely related, and everything above that has to be the same. So this is where you have to be able to start filling in your chart. So if we look at our next level for our dog, Canis familiaris, he is in the family Canidae, which is the canids or the canines. Okay, so obviously our wolf would have to have the same family. because they share the same genus, everything above that has to be the same. We have a blank here, okay, where we have the order for our dog, but over here we have the order for our wolf. So the dog would also have to be in the order Carnivora, okay, the carnivores. And then, of course, would also have to be a mammal, right? And then, obviously, would have to be a chordate. And they, of course, would have to be in the same domain, eukarya. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense how that we were able to fill that in. But we still have some blanks here. So we're going to have to kind of look around and see what we have in common again. So if we look at our genus, we did that. Family, we did that, right? Because we looked at Canidae, Canidae. Those are the only two families in common. So then what we do is we move up to order next. So one thing to notice here is, look what we have here. We have Carnivora, Carnivora, and Carnivora. So we actually have a few other carnivores in there. And remember what we said, because the wolf and the dog and Felis catus and Ursus arctus are in the same order, that means they must share everything else above that. So you should be able now to fill the rest of that in. Because if Ursus arctus, which is that grizzly bear, is a mammal, then the other carnivores have to be mammals too. And if they are all mammals, then they also all have to be chordates. Okay, so this carnivore is going to be a chordate. And even though this one has a different order, Cetacea, and this is a killer whale, by the way, Orcinus orca. It is the order Cetacean, which are the sea mammals. So we would have dolphins in there. And in fact, killer whales aren't whales. They're actually porpoises. They're just like large porpoises. So you'd have your porpoises, your dolphins, etc. in there. And you'll notice, though, that they are mammals as well. So they are in the same class as all of the other organisms. So now we can go ahead and say, okay, well, all mammals have to be chordates. And then they all have to be from the domain Eukarya. Okay, and so obviously, if it's a mammal and it's a chordate, it's going to be in the kingdom Animalia. It's a mammal and it's a chordate, it's going to have to be in the kingdom Animalia. So in a test situation, this is what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to be able to take the information that you're given in a chart like this and perhaps answer questions about it. Okay, which organisms are mostly related or most closely related? Which organisms are least closely related? Well, let's do that. I hope you can do the most closely related already. And hopefully you said the dog, Canis familiaris, and the wolf, Canis lupus. And the reason why they are the most closely related of any organisms in this particular chart is because they share the same genus. The only thing that's different with them is their species name. Okay, but wolves and dogs are still closely related enough that they interbreed, or they can interbreed if they have the opportunity to, but they're not considered the same species. Now, if I asked you which organisms on this chart were least closely related to one another, what would you do? If I asked you to give me an example of which organisms on this chart or which species on this chart are least related to one another. And again, you'd kind of approach it the same way. So you would kind of look and go, okay, this one here, our killer whale, has a different order. So you could say the killer whale and the wolf, or the killer whale and the domestic cat, or whatever, okay? Because they have the fewest levels in the hierarchical system in common with the others. Okay, so I hope that helps in terms of how you would actually be asked to use your knowledge of the hierarchical system and binomial nomenclature to answer questions. Now notice, you didn't have to know any of these organism names. I could have just made some up and it wouldn't have made a difference if they were like fictional scientific names, because being able to do what I asked you to do here is not dependent on your knowledge of individual species names. Okay, so don't be stressed out by that. We're going to move away from binomial nomenclature, hierarchical systems, etc., and kind of move on to the next section of this particular part of ecology. And we're going to start to talk about adaptations and changes in populations. So when we talk about adaptations, just generally speaking, an adaptation is anything that allows an organism to survive in its particular habitat or particular environment. Okay, so it's anything that the organism has evolved to have in terms of structure, behavior, or physiological responses that allows it to survive in its particular environment. So there's three categories that we're going to take a look at for adaptations. And some of them are a little bit easier to understand than others, but in any case, so we have structural. This is the one that kids are usually pretty good with because that just means an actual physical structure. So things like webbed feet, things like wings, things like canine teeth. Okay, so most kids are pretty good with understanding structural adaptations and how that allows organisms to survive in their environments. The other two, physiological and behavioral, sometimes can get a little bit confusing, especially physiological. Physiological is the way the body actually reacts to environmental stimuli internally. Okay, so it's an actual physiological response. So this would be things like hormones, heart rate, those kinds of things. And then behavioral adaptation, that is how an organism acts. So it's a behavior that the organism engages in that allows it to survive. Okay, so this would be things, for example, like when you see rabbits they kind of first see you and they just kind of freeze and stop moving. And that is a behavioral adaptation because predators are very, very visually orientated. So they will notice movement before they notice anything else. And so it's a behavioral adaptation on the part of the rabbit to freeze, so to speak, in the hopes that the predator does not see them. Okay, so that would be a behavioral adaptation that allows them to survive predation. Okay, so in terms of definitions, structural adaptation is regarding anatomical features. So this is an actual physical characteristic, anatomical characteristic. And an example of that for primates, so that would be us, as well as apes and monkeys, is that we not only have 5 digits or those fingers, right? But we have that thumb that is perpendicular to our hand, okay? And we call that an opposing thumb. And that allows for grasping tools and things that organisms that do not have an opposing thumb are not capable of doing. Okay, so that would be considered a structural adaptation. Now, when we talk about physiological, this is the operation or mechanics or physiology of anatomical structures. So, for example, we have closed circulatory systems, and our heart, as mammals, has that septum, remember, that divides the oxygenated blood side from the deoxygenated blood side, and it also pumps to circulate blood throughout our tissues with great efficiency, and that increases organ function, increases maintaining homeostasis, etc. Okay, so that would be a physiological adaptation. And then the last one would be behavior. And remember, this is a way that an organism acts in response to something in the environment that allows better survival chances. Okay, so an example of that was the one I already used with the rabbit. Another example would be mating calls from birds. So particularly in the spring, you can hear birds chirping all over the place, and they recognize each other's mating calls. So in other words, that is considered to be a behavioral adaptation, because if they didn't recognize each other as members of the same species because of their mating calls, then their chances of reproducing and having offspring to continue the line of the species would be greatly diminished. So that mating call situation is considered to be a behavioral adaptation. There's a couple of different organisms here that we're just going to take a look at to talk a little bit about the difference between those three types of adaptations. So the structural, the physiological, and of course the behavioral. So let's just kind of take a look here. And some of them the graphics will actually kind of demonstrate more than one, or we can talk about more than one. So let's maybe start up here with this little rodent here, and then we'll kind of move clockwise. So you can see that this rodent is in a little nest here, appears to be hibernating, kind of has a food stash here, some acorns. And so if we look at the hibernation piece, the hibernation would be considered both behavioral adaptation, but then there also is going to be a physiological component to it. So I want you to think just briefly about how the behavior of hibernation is beneficial to the survival of the species. So just give that a second thought here. And then I want you to think about, secondly, when an organism is hibernating, so sleeping through the winter, truthfully hibernating, what types of physiological things will happen in order to make sure that the organism actually survives that hibernation period without eating or drinking or whatever? So typically organisms will hibernate and practice that behavior when food sources are unavailable during the winter months. Okay, and that is why they have to eat a lot during the summer and the fall in order to stock up their fat reserves so that they can live off that fat through the winter. So the behavioral adaptation piece is to survive a period of time when food is going to be scarce. Now, from a physiological point of view, I want you to think about that. So you have an organism that is hibernating for several months with taking in no or very little calories or water. What types of physiological things might have to happen? Well, we're going to have a tremendous slowdown of heart rate and a tremendous slowdown of metabolic processes in order to maintain life over that long period of time and not use up all of those calories in the form of the fat reserves. So hibernation would be considered both a behavioral and a physiological adaptation that would allow the organism to survive those months of scarcity in terms of food. Moving over to our snake here, the thing that snakes of course have many adaptations, but the one that I want us to pay attention to is the production of the venom. So would you consider venom to be the venom itself, production of venom, so not the fangs or whatever, but the production of venom? Would you consider that to be a structural adaptation, a behavioral adaptation, or a physiological adaptation? Where do you feel that would best fit? And if you said physiological, then you are correct, because it's physiology that allows this organism to actually produce venom. And in terms of how that helps the organism in terms of survival, the venom helps them in terms of prey and being able to subdue prey. So rather than struggling with whatever they have caught, whether it's a rabbit or a rodent or whatever it is, that venom subdues and immobilizes the prey so that it can be easily swallowed by the snake. Okay, so that production of venom, because the snake is actually producing a substance, is going to be physiological, not behavioral or anatomical. The structural anatomical piece would be like the fangs themselves, okay, allowing that grasping of the prey. So moving down here, we have what's called a fennec, and a fennec is a very small fox, the size really of a very small house cat. And fennec foxes dwell in the desert regions, okay, of North America, as well as Africa, depending on the species. And if we take a look here, we see some characteristics that are very typical of desert species. And one of the main adaptations is camouflage. So you can see that these fox are made to blend in with their desert environment. Okay, and then from a structural point of view, we have these very, very large ears. And large ears like these on these foxes are filled with very dense capillary networks. Okay, so lots of blood vessels in those big ears. And the whole point of those big ears, in terms of them being a structural adaptation, is that it allows heat as the blood passes through those very, very numerous capillaries in the ears. Then heat is removed from the body, and that allows the fox to maintain homeostasis, okay, in terms of body temperature, because these are warm-blooded organisms, so they have to be able to get rid of that heat. So those large ears, characteristic of these desert foxes, would be considered a structural adaptation. And so would the color of the fur too, for camouflage. Over here we have an Arctic hare, and I kind of put these against each other, the fox, desert fox, and then the Arctic hare, because they live in very different biomes, obviously. And I want you to take note of how small the Arctic hare's ears are, and that's going to be for the opposite reason. Large ears run the risk of frostbite. They also lose a tremendous amount of heat, and so these little tiny ears are still large enough for them to have good hearing and be able to hear predators, but they restrict that heat loss so that the energy can be conserved. Now, in terms of the fur, just like the rabbits here, the Arctic hares will change color with the seasons. So in the winter, they are going to be white for camouflage, just like the rabbits here are, the hares here are, and then they are going to turn into that browny color in the summer for camouflage for that short period of time in the tundra. Now, that actual change of fur color is actually a physiological adaptation. Okay, they don't control it. It's not like behavior. It's physiological. It's a chemical change that happens in the body as the seasons change in order to ensure that the hare actually has good camouflage depending on what type of or what season it is. Now, we can't see here, but the Arctic hares are sometimes also called snowshoe hares because they have very large feet which spread their body mass out over the surface of the snow and allows them to not sink. Okay, so that's going to be an anatomical or a structural adaptation as well. So our last organism here that we'll take a look at is, of course, the Canada goose, which I think everybody recognizes. And there's a couple different adaptations that we can talk about with the goose. So one of the most obvious, of course, is these webbed feet. These are waterfowl, and so they are not super graceful on land, but those webbed feet are very conducive for mobility in the water. Another adaptation that all waterfowl will have, not just the Canada geese, is they produce oil, which they, if you ever see them kind of preening or, like kind of rubbing their bills through their fur, they are actually distributing oil throughout their feathers because that's waterproofing. Okay, so it's actually a type of lipid that allows for them to not get saturated with water, okay, because if they did, they get too cold. So they kind of have that waterproofing thing. Now, so that production of wax would be a physiological response. The webbed feet would be a structural adaptation. Okay, the wax or the oil would be a physiological adaptation. And then in terms of behavior, we can talk about migration. So all birds that migrate will do so because their food sources are not available in the year, okay, or during the winter time, I should say. So if you take a look at birds that stay around here all year, you see them even in the wintertime. So that would be like blue jays, crows, magpies, ravens. That's because they have very varied food sources and they're very creative in terms of what they eat. And so they can actually survive through the winter. But any organisms like the waterfowl, the ducks, the geese that rely on aquatic organisms for their food sources primarily are going to have to migrate and move with the seasons to where the food sources are still available. So as the ponds and the wetlands, etc., the lakes, etc., freeze in the wintertime, they don't have the access to their food sources. And if you think of other types of birds that we see here in the spring and the summer, like robins, for example, they are primarily insectivores. So they are going to feed on worms and bugs and that kind of stuff. Again, that food source is not available in the wintertime, so they are going to be migratory as well. So I hope these examples help you distinguish between those three types of adaptations, because in a test situation, you will kind of have to look at different organisms or watch a video of different organisms or whatever, and be able to kind of discuss which adaptations that you see are going to be structural versus behavioral versus physiological. Okay, and I hope that helps. So you probably noticed when you've looked at different members of the same species, whether it's different rabbits or birds or dogs or whatever, that they aren't all identical to one another, that there's variation among them with respect to things like size and shape and color and fur thickness or feathers, etc., etc. And that's what we call variation. And so one of the really important things to remember about variation when we're talking about species is that variation primarily occurs in organisms that reproduce sexually. And just for clarity purposes, when we say an organism reproduces sexually, that means that there is, in one way or another, the union of egg and sperm to create offspring. Okay, so organisms that reproduce asexually, that means that there is no egg and sperm involved, and the result is that offspring are identical to one another. Okay, so there is very limited variation compared to organisms that reproduce sexually. So if you think of like yourself, for example, 50% of your genetic material came from your mother, 50% of your genetic material came from your biological father, and you are only 50% genetically the same as your full blood siblings. So not only is that there that variation in terms of the genetic material you receive from both biological parents, but there are also processes involved during meiosis, okay, which is when the eggs and the sperm are created, that ensure tremendous variation as well. Now, we don't go into those until Bio 30, but the key takeaway here is that organisms that reproduce sexually are going to have far more variation than organisms that reproduce asexually without the use of egg and sperm. And so an example of an asexually reproducing organism would be one of those protists like we talked about before, which would be that amoeba. Okay, so remember we talked about amoebas being single-celled. We talked about them being eukaryotic, okay, meaning that they have a membrane-bound nucleus with the DNA in that nucleus, and they are unicellular, right? They are in the kingdom Protista. Okay, so when we talk about asexual reproduction, when an amoeba gets really large, and for an amoeba that would be the size of a pinhead. So some amoebas can get large enough that you can actually see them, size of a pinhead, but that is a huge amoeba. And by the time the amoeba gets that large, its surface area is too large, and it cannot actually maintain life because there is just too much surface area for the metabolic processes to actually take care of all of that entire organism. And so what will happen when an amoeba gets really, really large is it will replicate the genetic material that is in its nucleus, and then it will simply divide into two. And so we have a parent amoeba, and then from that parent amoeba, after division, we have two what we call daughter cells, daughter amoebas, that are genetically identical to that parent. And this is a process called binary fission, okay? So when we talk about asexual reproduction, all that amoeba did was replicated the genetic material, the cell membrane pinched, and then organelles were divided evenly, cytoplasm was divided evenly among the two daughter cells, and then we have two offspring that are genetically the same as the parent. Now, can a mutation happen here and there? Yeah, but by far the greatest amount of variation happens when organisms reproduce sexually with egg and sperm, okay? So just to distinguish between those two. And we'll learn more about that in Bio 30. So when we talk about a gene pool, and again, we learn more about this at the 30 level, a gene pool consists of all the different forms that a gene can have in a breeding population, and we call those alleles. So if we kind of think back to what we just said about your biological mother, biological father, so humans have 46 chromosomes, so you get 23 chromosomes from your biological mother's egg, and you get 23 chromosomes from your biological father's sperm cell. Okay, so they contribute half of your chromosomal total each. Okay, now the thing is though, is on each of those chromosomes, there are genes for various different characteristics. So things like eye color, things like are your earlobes attached or are they loose? Things like can you roll your tongue or not? Okay, height, weight, all these different things that are primarily genetically controlled. Now, if you think about it, if you think about things like height and eye color and skin color, there's huge variation, and that's because there's many different forms that the gene can take, and we call those alleles. Okay, we call those alleles. So remember back when we talked about blood types, you could get the type O allele from your father and the type O allele from your mother, and then you'd be type O blood. Okay, but if you got the A allele from your mother and the O allele from your father, you'd be type B blood. So those are the same genes, the blood type genes, but whether it's the A or the B or the which allele it is, or the O or whatever, that is an allele or a form of the gene. So the gene pool is all of the genes that are in a certain population. Okay, so individuals of a population, as we already said, especially if they reproduce sexually, are not going to be identical to one another. And the causes of these differences is because of the processes inherent to the production of egg and sperm, okay, which again we talk about more at the 30 level. But another main source of variation among individuals is mutations, okay? So mutations occur all the time. So if you have, if you're nearsighted, that's a mutation, okay, because your eyeball is misshaped, and so the image isn't projected properly at the back of the retina, okay, so that would be an example of a mutation. If you have a middle toe that is longer than your big toe, that is a mutation, okay, so, you know, they aren't always bad. Sometimes they're like whatever, but a mutation is anything that causes a difference among individuals of the same species or within individuals of the same species. Okay, and there's lots of different mutations. So by definition, a mutation is a change in the coding of one's DNA. Now, why do mutations happen? There's lots of different reasons mutations can happen. Sometimes it's just completely random. Okay, so when we look at things like nearsightedness, a longer middle toe, if you have dimples, for example, red hair is a mutation. So when we look at these different types of mutations, you know, sometimes they're just random, okay? But sometimes these mutations can arise because the DNA of an individual, particularly in the early stages of pregnancy, are exposed to either something we call mutagens or radiation. Now, I'm pretty sure you know what radiation is. So you can receive radiation from the sun. Okay, so UVA, UVB rays is a source of radiation, and that causes mutation in skin cells and can lead to skin cancer, right? But if you think of X-rays, if you ever go into the dentist's office or whatever, they'll always put an apron of lead, particularly over females if they are doing X-rays, and that is to protect the eggs and in males the sperm from the radiation, because the radiation can actually cause mutations in the genetic material. And that's also why they will always ask females of childbearing age when they are going to have an X-ray of their body if they are pregnant, because if the female is pregnant, then the fetus can be very adversely affected by exposure to the radiation. Okay, so what is a mutagen then? A mutagen is anything that upon exposure to that genetic material can be affected and cause mutations. And typically, if we're not talking about radiation, we're talking about chemical mutagens. And an example of a chemical mutagen in an everyday scenario would be aspartame. Aspartame, which of course is a artificial sweetener, so like Diet Coke, for example, has aspartame. And in laboratory studies where they give very large amounts of aspartame to test subjects, primarily rats, they see that there is a correlation between that consumption of aspartame and cancer. So it is considered to be a mutagen because it causes cancer. Okay, so again, anything that causes a mutation is called a mutagen, and typically we refer to those as the chemical component. Medications, for example, too, can also be chemical mutagens. So women are not supposed to take medications during pregnancy. And of course, radiation or exposure to radiation for both males and females can cause mutations. But, you know, sometimes the mutations are just random and they're not always bad. So usually when we refer to mutations, we always kind of think of that in a negative connotation, that, you know, mutations are a bad thing, but that's not always necessarily so. So again, key takeaway from this slide is that sexual reproduction, by virtue of the processes in meiosis, which we learn more about in Bio 30, results in much greater variation than in organisms like our amoeba that reproduce asexually. Mutations can also result if DNA is exposed, especially at the early stages of an organism's development, to mutagens or radiation. So we're going to take a look at this slide to discuss the difference between variation within and among species. So on the previous slide, we talked about mutations and we talked about sexual reproduction as means by which organisms will actually not be identical to one another, particularly those organisms or individuals that reproduce sexually. Okay, so we're going to take a look now at just the subtle difference between within and among species. The one that we spend the most time on is variation within species, because that's important for concepts of evolution and natural selection, etc., which we're going to learn in the next section. But variation among species, rather, just to distinguish between the two, that would be like if we're looking at two bear species that are closely related to one another. And I use that example because we looked at that already. So remember, we had the Ursus arctos, the grizzly bear, and the Ursus americanus, which was the black bear. And those organisms obviously share the same genus, very closely related to one another, but obviously there is variation among those two species in terms of their characteristics, right? We can talk about size, we can talk about that hump on the grizzly. There's many other differences as well. Coat color, etc., etc. So that would be what we're talking about when we say variation among species. Now, the one that we're going to focus on going forward is variation within a species. So that means variation within members of the same species. So we can take a look at a few little examples here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but let's just take a look at a few. So this one down here is a little bit freaky. These are actually pigeon eyes, and pigeons are also known as rock doves. That's actually their proper name. But you can see that these little pigeon eyes show us that even though these are all the same species, they are all rock doves, all pigeons. They have variations in feather color. They have variations in eye color, even though they're all the same species. So that would be as a result of mutation, sexual reproduction, but variation within a species. If we take a look at our zebras here, now this little guy here has a very obviously different coat pattern than the other zebras, so that would be variation within a species as well. But in fact, even without that little guy who looks significantly different, then no two zebras have exactly the same coat pattern. To us, they might kind of all look the same, but they certainly don't to each other. And when a mother zebra is ready to give birth, she actually has to separate herself from the herd, which is dangerous because predators, when there's a whole herd of zebras together, those stripe patterns all kind of mix and mingle and make it very difficult for them to actually single out an individual to pursue. So it's very dangerous for the mother zebra to move away from the herd when she's ready to deliver her baby. But the reason that has to be done is the baby has to do two things in order to ensure its survival besides get up and run really fast, really quickly. The zebra must imprint on its own little brain the mother's very unique smell or scent. And secondly, the baby has to get a good eye on the mother's coat pattern, and that stripe pattern has to imprint on the baby's brain as well, so that the baby can recognize its mother in and amongst that herd of all these zebras that to us kind of look very, very similar to one another. So that would be another example of variation within a species. It doesn't always have to be dramatic. So when we look at those pigeon eyes and pigeon feather colors, we can very easily see the difference between them. When we look at the zebras, the differences are much more subtle, but that does not make them any less significant depending on what that particular difference is for. So I hope that helps clarify the difference between variation within and among species. So back to mutations. We talked about mutations being usually associated with negative things, but in fact, mutations may be detrimental, of course, but they also may be neutral, which means they do not enhance or take away from the ability of the individual to survive, or they may actually be beneficial. So when we talk about mutations, a mutation may be detrimental if it causes a disease or a disorder. So we talked about like cancer, for example, and it decreases the organism's chances of survival. A mutation may be neutral, so it may neither hinder nor help the organism in terms of survival. And then, of course, lastly, a mutation may actually even be beneficial, depending on what the mutation is. But any mutation that actually increases the chance of the organism's surviving is what we call a selective advantage. Okay, it may produce something that is beneficial. So if we look at our little images over on the right here, we can kind of talk about which one of these is which. So I want you to kind of see if you can label which one of these mutations would be beneficial, which one would be detrimental, which one would be neutral. And the baby's not a mutation. I'm talking about the little dimples that the little baby has, those cute little dimples. And then, of course, we have a snake that is white, so that would be an albino. And then, of course, we have this bug here that engaging in a process called mimicry. So what do we think here? See if you can figure that out. Dimples would be considered neutral, okay, because they're neither harmful nor beneficial, but they are a mutation, but they are kind of really super cute. So I don't know, maybe that's beneficial. Maybe that helps individuals survive because they're like super cute. I don't know, but it is a mutation, and it's a mutation because the connective fibers are actually too tight in the cheeks. So when a person with dimples smiles, they kind of pull, and they cause that cheek tissue to kind of pull in. But in any case, it would be considered to be neutral. Now, this snake is an albino. If you're a predator in the natural setting, not super beneficial to be an albino because it makes it pretty tough for you to sneak up on your prey. If you're an albino, also makes you very susceptible to sun damage and cancer, skin cancer, even if you are an animal, and as opposed to like a human. And so this would be something that we would call a detrimental mutation, okay, that albinism. And albinism can occur in any living thing. So, you've seen those rabbits with the red eyes before. Humans can be albino as well, and there are definitely health disadvantages that come with being albino. So that would be considered to be a detrimental mutation. And then lastly, this would be considered to be a beneficial mutation. This kind of evolution to look more like a plant leaf, because it helps, of course, in terms of camouflage, right? So if you're a predator, it helps you access your prey by being able to sneak up. If you are prey yourself, it helps you hide from predators. So that's one important thing, is that mutations are not always harmful, even though we typically, it has that connotation of being negative. They actually can be neutral, and they can be beneficial as well. Now, the important takeaway here is that if the mutation is beneficial, okay, so like this bug at the bottom there, and it produces a selective advantage, then that individual is going to be more likely to survive and pass on its genetic material to its offspring. So by definition, a selective advantage is an adaptation that allows for a better chance of survival in the natural world. I actually am not going to do any annotation on this slide. Just read through these two examples because they're good examples of selective advantage, and particularly the antibiotic resistant bacteria, very relevant for this day and age when we talk about microbes. So the last two concepts that we are going to cover for this section of ecology are natural selection versus artificial selection. And these terms are terms that become important in Biology 30 as well, so definitely worth knowing and understanding. So of course, environments are fluid and they're changing all the time. So environments never stay the same. If we look at biomes as they exist today, they're different than they were even 30 years ago. So over time, the environment changes in a way to favor those with the favorable mutations. Now remember that if a mutation is beneficial, that means that it will result in a selective advantage, right, for the individual that has that mutation. And that means that that individual is more likely to survive, reproduce, and hopefully their offspring will have that same beneficial DNA, that same beneficial mutation. Okay, so this selective process of refining a population's characteristics so that they are best suited to the environment over time is based on something called the theory of natural selection. And the, of course, father of the theory of natural selection is Charles Darwin. And we're going to talk about that in the next section when we talk about evolution. But I'm sure you've heard of Charles Darwin before, obviously a very prominent scientist. And in any case, natural selection basically means that the environment puts pressure on organisms to change over time in terms of their gene pool. Okay, so now that doesn't mean organisms can change during their lifetime. What it does mean is that over time, the gene pool of a population can change over time in response to pressure from the environment. So individuals that are best suited to the environment are going to be the ones that are more likely to survive. And we'll look at that in more detail in the next section. But the important takeaway here is that when we talk about natural selection, it is the environment that is in charge of applying the pressure to a population. And this is what happens in the natural world. Okay, this is not what happens in zoos. This is not what happens when individuals are breeding racehorses. Okay, this is what happens in the natural world when organisms are in their natural habitats and their natural environments without human intervention. Okay, so that piece is very, very important. Now, the other concept that I'm going to leave you guys with today is artificial selection. And notice here, instead of natural, it's artificial. And artificial selection means that we are not dealing with organisms that are in their natural environment. It is not the environment that is putting pressure on the population to change. Okay, it is humans deciding which individuals are going to be allowed to reproduce. Now, artificial selection has been used for centuries with plants. So when we cross different types of corn plants, we cross different types of wheat plants, we create varieties of roses, right? Like initially, I don't know, there's something like 12 to 15 natural versions of roses. Now there's like literally hundreds of them. And that's as a result of humans actually deciding we're going to cross this rose with this rose and see what we get. We're going to cross this corn with this corn, see what we get. We're going to cross this cow with this cow, see what we get. So, okay, we do that with animals as well. Think of dog breeds. They all descended from wolves. Okay, all of that is natural selection. You need a dog that's good at herding. Okay, well, there's certain characteristics that we're going to select for. Racehorses, okay, is another example. And artificial selection, obviously very widely used in agriculture with both plants and animals.